Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by Royal Retros, the king of throwbacks. Hey, if you're looking for teams and leagues that don't exist anymore, but you'd like to remember them in high-quality jersey or uniform format, hey, some of those teams were legendary. Some of them were disasters, but they all live at Royal Retros. Check them out. RoyalRetros.com. Use that promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Check them out now. And now, check out this episode.
Wilson, the native of suburban Chicago. Mesa, a native of the Dominican Republic. The closing battery here at the Kingdom trying to end it. Now the stretch. The 2-2 pitch on the way to Rusty Greer from Jose Mesa. Swing and a fly ball hit into left center field, and moving over is Hunter on the run. He's got it, and an era is over. The Mariners win it in unbelievable fashion, 5-2. My, oh my! This place exploding, 56,530 with flash bulbs going off. You would think the Mariners had just won the World Series. They haven't, but it's the best thing until it comes along.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, hello there, everybody. My name is Tim Hanlon. It is Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thanks for finding us. Hope your new year is off to a rip-roaring start. I am already battling my first cold of the season, and hopefully it will be short-lived, but with some deeper tone and gravelier voice. I welcome you to this week's proceedings. And we go back to, well, that point in time that you just kind of got into the mixture of. That was from 1999. You remember that date? It was June 27th, I believe, of 1999, when Jose Mesa gets Rusty Greer to fly out for the final out as the Seattle Mariners win their final game at the venerable Kingdom in Seattle, which was first erected or opened, I guess, was erected certainly before then. It was built before then. In 1976, you NASL soccer fans will remember Soccer Bowl 76 was played there. The Major League Baseball All-Star Game there was played in 1979. All kinds of memories, including not only the Mariners, but the Seattle Seahawks, arguably one of the major reasons for its construction in the first place, along with the baseball team of the Mariners there, but also for a number of years was the home of the Seattle Supersonics as they were moving about and casting around for their own sort of home, if you will, within the in the region, and so many other things. I think there were some Seattle Sounders, NASL, not only quote unquote outdoor games, but also indoor games. There as well. Why do we talk about that? Well, it's part of a fascinating conversation this week with our guest, Helen Morgan Parmett, who is a professor of, I love this title, she is the Lawrence Professor of Forensics and also an Associate Professor of English and Film and Television Studies, all that stuff at the University of Vermont. And she has an amazingly interesting book out from the University of Illinois Press that we're going to be talking about this week and the topics there within. It's called Stadium City, Sports and Media Infrastructure in the United States. And the Seattle Kingdom and what was before it and came after it, obviously Safeco Field, or what was originally known as Safeco Field. I think it's T-Mobile Park now, if I'm not mistaken, the baseball stadium, as well as Lumen Field, where the Sounders currently play, as well as the Seahawks, has taken over for the Kingdom. We talk about Seattle, but also similar phenomena in Atlanta and Minneapolis, as each of those cities set the tone for some very interesting and educational and thematic points around what the role of stadia are in metropolitan areas. And in the case of this conversation with Dr. Morgan Parmett, we talk about how stadiums are not just places where some of our favorite teams and leagues and performers do their thing. But they also represent many other facets of societal and economic realities, right? Certainly there's the economic engine component of it. And on a number of other occasions, we've discussed some of the issues around that politically and geographically and demographically, there you go, or demography, how neighborhoods are built or destroyed or rebuilt or rethought. We'll talk about all that kind of stuff. Sorry, the Battery in Atlanta is now the North Star for just about everybody in professional sports now. Everybody wants to create not only a stadium, but also the environment around it, whether it be a mixed use, retail, all kinds of other revenue streams, frankly, to 365, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, beyond what the games themselves might bring to the core structure, the stadium. We talk about Minneapolis and its sojourn from multi-purpose stadia like Metropolitan Stadium, which was built for both baseball and for football and for NASL soccer, and how that's morphed into the first generation dome in the Humphrey Metrodome, and now, of course, the awesomely, amazingly architecturally splendid U.S. Bank Stadium there up in Minneapolis. These three cities, Seattle, Atlanta, and Minneapolis, all sort of have some similarities to them in that they've all evolved from these multi-purpose stadia of the late 60s, early 70s to the sort of first generation of domed and more modern kinds of structures, still also designed as mostly multi-purpose. And now this sort of migration to splitting those into perhaps sports and event-specific places where the individual teams, if a city is able to do so, for example, in Minneapolis, you've got U.S. Bank Stadium for the Vikings, and you've got Target Field for baseball. And tomorrow I could talk about the St. Paul facility, the place where the Minnesota FC plays for Major League Soccer. But the reality is that it's almost like now teams not only desire, but absolutely foundationally and economically need their own stadium, regardless of other teams that might want to utilize those to control those revenue streams. But it's not just economic. It's also, as I hinted at, societally and all, the collision between media and event presentation and that of sports and the stage, frankly, that is a stadium now. These are experiences, not necessarily just games to go to. And as a whole sort of raft of very smart and intellectually challenging concepts here that we're going to go through. And our goal is not only to entertain you and look back on some of the oddities of forgotten things in sports, but also to kind of project a little bit into the future and get a little bit more cultured and sophisticated, shall we say, about what we're in the midst of here. And the stadium is something we kind of overlook sometimes. And sometimes it's architecture, and as we talked about with people like Paul Goldberger, and sometimes it's the economics of it, and sometimes it's the oddities. We've talked about a lot of oddly shaped and historical structures and stuff. But let's get a little bit more, a little bit more sophisticated understanding of what these structures are all about and the multidimensionalism, if you will, of these things we call stadiums here in the United States and elsewhere. A quick plug for the book. It is really very intriguing if you fancy yourself as a sophisticated sports fan that likes to go beyond just the gambling aura of the games and the hot takes on players and trade bait and all that kind of stuff. You owe it to yourself to get a copy of this book, again, by the University of Illinois Press. It is called Stadium City: Sports and Media Infrastructure in the United States. And it is authored by the good doctor, Helen Morgan Parmett, our guest. Coming up, let's get to it, shall we? This is a really intriguing set of thoughts and conversation. I hope you enjoyed as much as I had creating it for you this week. So, as always, please enjoy. let's talk about your background first, and in particular, your line of work. And I was fascinated to see you essentially have two sort of titles at the University of Vermont in both forensics and then as a professor of English and film and television studies. Explain that to me, because that's a fascinating combination, and how one gets to that.
Yeah, well, I am an associate professor, and my work is in critical media studies, which at UVM is really located in the film and TV studies program, which is part of the English department. And I also am director of the Lawrence Debate Union. So that's the forensics component, where forensics is not the sort of like criminal forensics, I think that some people think about, but is a matter of like speech and rhetoric. So the connection between debate and English is actually one that comes through. They'll both have a long history of studying rhetorical studies. Both, English obviously more through the written form, and then debate through the oral form. And so that is where we have a sort of shared history. And debate wasn't always located in English. That's been a sort of more recent thing at UVM, but there is a long history in the world of speech communication, in which speech communication has been located in English.
So, but a lot of what we're going to be talking about, though, is kind of framed on that sort of, I guess, broadly, that media and otherwise communication-oriented kind of dynamic. Is that a fair way to say?
So I don't really do any research in debate. That's more of a sort of like administrative role that I play. Although I do think that my work is still sort of informed from my background. My master's degree was in rhetorical studies, so I do think, which is a part of communication studies, and so that some of my analysis, I think, especially of like archival documents, really, I think, draws on the history of my background in rhetorical studies. But yeah, the focus is really more on media studies and really thinking about media in this sort of like materialist sense, not only as a form of like communication as we think about it as like talking between you and me, or mediation in terms of representation, but also in terms of the sort of like communication infrastructures that make mediation possible.
So that's very interesting, and I think I can see the through line here as we sort of segue into the focus here. So tell me how that background, that professional expertise in and around that realm gets you to the quote unquote idea of stadiums, and perhaps maybe the impetus for this book in particular.
Yeah, so it sort of has, I think, two points of departure. And the first comes from my first book, which was on media production practices in post-Katrina New Orleans. And there, in that book, I was also kind of interested in New Orleans as a site of media production, beyond just sort of how New Orleans is represented on screen, and more so looking at media production practices. So New Orleans, is kind of known as Hollywood South. And before Hurricane Katrina in 2005, it had really started to attract a lot of film and TV production because of its generous tax incentives. But after Hurricane Katrina, there was a sort of crisis about like what would happen to that particular portion of the city's, creative industrial infrastructure. And so a lot of the production started to become framed around like, how can production help to rebuild the city of New Orleans after Katrina? So I ended up writing a book about the HBO series Treme, and kind of thinking about the ways in which how its production practices, which were really focused on like on location filming with local hiring. I mean, even like by season 2, even all of it's a very musical show. It's really focused on New Orleans music culture. And by season 2, they had started having even like a lot of the musicians performing on set, so that those musicians could get the royalty dollars from that, rather than it being paid out to whoever owned the copyright to their songs.
Very interesting. It's very, very considerative. What's the word I'm
Yeah.
looking for? Very considerate. There you go. Of the locals and the needs and how to. Yes, it's very interesting.
Yeah, so I was kind of interested in how media production was influencing the rebuilding of the city after Katrina and the role of the sort of like creative cultural industries in that, which I think are a little bit of a mixed bag. And so it definitely had a very big ethic, but the way in which that played out in terms of like valuing particular, neighborhoods and cultural practices over others was also, I think, complex. And so that is sort of my intellectual background. And then while I was attending a conference in the city of Seattle. Um, it was maybe around like 2014. I accidentally booked a hotel right next to the stadiums. Or I guess incidentally, it wasn't like an accident. I didn't intend to be next to the stadiums. I was just in town for a conference. That was the hotel I booked. And I was rooming with a friend who writes about sports. And I write about space and city space, and being next to the stadiums just really struck us. And it was sort of like when the Seahawks were like having a really great season and everybody was super excited about them. And you could just sort of see the ways in which sports just so influenced that particular neighborhood and the city more broadly. So we just started talking a lot about sports and the production of space, and I started to see connections between some of the cultural and political implications of media production in New Orleans and the ways that sports as a sort of cultural production was also sort of influencing city space and neighborhood practices in ways that were kind of eerily similar. And that's when my friend and I started kind of thinking about this project. She eventually ended up dropping out and left academia. And I thought, oh, well, she's the sports person, so I'll just like put the project away. But like every city I traveled to, I just kept being struck by the ways in which sporting infrastructure was sort of remaking neighborhood space in a way that similar to New Orleans, and how media production wasn't so focused on these sort of like, big commodified, cultural pictures of the city, but were like hyper specific about like neighborhood and place and identity and history. And these newer stadiums that were being built were really sort of turning to that like more sort of place-based focused as well. And it just was really interesting to me. And no matter how many times I tried to put the book down, I couldn't. And so I just said, I guess I'm gonna write it on my own. So I did.
You call this the sort of the sportification of place. I think it's a really interesting dynamic to consider, because I think perhaps I see the through line of your New Orleans experience, because in our explorations of especially teams that have come, and leagues that have come and gone, or been previously domiciled or relocated and stuff. And you do get into some of this in your descriptions of the three major ones in your book. There is something of a I want to call it a soul of the city, but sort of there's a civic pride, if you will, and it has historically been, especially with pro sports in the earlier years, right? The idea of gaining one or more professional league sports teams in one's city as a validation, if you will, of one's majorness. I have a feeling that has something perhaps a little bit to do with some of this, especially from the historical or cultural relationship that a city has with sports and its teams and its facilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And the book ended up being a lot more historical than I sort of anticipated it being when I first started out. And I was really just going to write about this sort of like new stage of stadium building that I really think started to take place after the Baltimore Orioles built the Orioles Park at Camden Yard. And that was, I think, really a return to this idea of sort of like, really urban baseball, but sort of like place-based identities. Whereas the moment in time that you're talking about, right, really is like what I call the second generation of stadium building in the US, which, I sort of talk about in the book how like generations of stadium building is like a lot, Lots of people have different typologies. For me, there's sort of like three stages, like the first generation of like the early ballparks, and second generation in like the 50s and 60s, and then third generation being sort of like post Camden. But this second generation, absolutely, this was a time in which cities were really trying to put themselves on the map and become considered big league, which meant like attracting businesses and investment and attracting residents to their cities. And it was also a time in which the sports leagues, especially baseball, but also the NFL, was starting to sort of spread out in the West and into the South. And so attracting a major professional sports league was a way of a city kind of announcing itself as, being in business and being, ready to kind of like, move up the echelon of cities in terms of importance and capitalist value.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had, I can tell your relative youth by how you frame that, because we've had some conversations about baseball. In particular, Paul Goldberger is a well-known architectural critic,
Yes.
specific about baseball. And I think I would argue that there's probably at least two generations of stadia, even before your first generation. But if from a modern perspective, I totally get it. And I would imagine with Seattle, right, your framing of that sort of second generation was really the former Kingdom largely, right? Which was
Yep.
sort of this multi-purpose thing. Maybe a little bit of background about the Seattle situation you found yourself in as you got the spark for this book, because you're talking about an area that's it's sort of just south, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly, as a former resident, just
Mhm.
south of Pioneer Square, right? Which is sort of a kind of fun and artsy kind of place, right?
Yeah, I mean, Pioneer Square is a really fascinating neighborhood in the city, and it's just sort of like south of the sort of downtown area. And so the ballpark and the NFL stadium that are in Seattle now are right directly on the border of the southern border of Pioneer Square, and part of what historically had been called the industrial district, or the Duwamish industrial district. So it was, an industrial area that primarily kind of serviced the port, and had like major manufacturing, and, other sort of like big industry. And so when that site was chosen for the Kingdom, there had been a big debate about, where to locate it. And ultimately, they decided on the King Street location after lots of back and forth, and especially the mayor's office had kind of supported like the downtown Seattle center area. Other folks were pushing for the suburbs, but it got located in this industrial area. And so it's a kind of, I think, showing also the shift of the city from, a kind of industrial economy to this post-industrial economy where like sports and culture have become so much more central to the inner workings of Seattle, and indeed like all of the cities across the US, and to an extent globally.
Well, it's interesting because the Lumen Field, which is the football and soccer, and actually I remember it back the early 2000s, I guess late 90s, early 2000s. It was, I think, officially or technically called the Football Soccer Stadium Complex, right? Where it was purposefully inclusive of both of those sports, and soccer has a history in Seattle prior to MLS. But I digress on that. But it was almost purposefully done that way. But then the baseball park then came shortly thereafter. But it's interesting how it was designated for that section of the city, which by its location, right, would pull a bunch of gravity away from quote unquote downtown and or Pioneer Square and or some of the, or arguably, maybe in your perspective, it's a little different. Perhaps maybe it's now creating a different and more viable um, how can cultural center in addition to all these other neighborhoods in Seattle. Maybe it's like an add-on. It's a plus one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that so those stadiums, it was actually the ballpark that came first. I mean, they kind of came around the same time. The ballpark was actually built first, and then what's now Lumen Field what was sort of started, or they broke ground on it shortly thereafter. But the Kingdom, it was really ending up in the industrial district was A lot because there was just so much debate about where to locate it and nobody could agree. And they had so many people like working on it and votes about it. And there was a lot of resistance sort of organized against it, especially from this one character, Frank Ruano, who initially was like part of the ballpark committee, but then got sort of sidelined. And then he started to, file all these lawsuits against the locations. And so it became a whole sort of issue. And so, I mean, part of the reason why the Kingdom ended up in the industrial district has to do with the really like site-specific politics of Seattle at that particular time. In the 1970s. And then the other part is, at that time, building like a big concrete dome surrounded by parking lots also required a really particular kind of locale. And so one of the reasons why the Seattle Center was rejected was because it wouldn't provide, the kind of parking and easy on and off access from the highway that was required of a kind of stadium at that time. And then, so the stadiums being built on the location of the Kingdom, there was some debate about where to build the new stadiums when they decided that the Kingdom was no longer going to be sufficient. But they pretty quickly decided to keep them in the industrial district. But the district, is definitely changing on the basis of those stadiums being built there. And it's, surrounded by other sites in the city that are kind of tourist sites like Pioneer Square, which is it was created as a historic district in the 1970s. And then the Chinatown International District is, sort of directly to the east and the south of the industrial district. And so it's also been sort of folded in then to these sort of like cultural touristic sites of development in the city as well.
And shame on me. The now T-Mobile Park was 1999, and the I believe the what is now Lumen Field was, I think, 2002. But that was
Yeah.
a heady time in Seattle, right? Because you had really one facility that was avant-garde back in the 70s and early 80s as a dual and multi-purpose kind of functional thing, almost being, if you will, culturally and geographically rejected for two facilities, right, that were more endemic to the main sports that were kind of driving sort of the cultural and aesthetic kind of presentation and, or to your point, cultural production, if you will, of these sports.
Yeah, and there was really, by the end of the 70s, there was a real rejection of these, what people sort of labeled as like concrete donuts, these cookie cutter, multi-purpose domed stadiums that were to be, housing multiple sports. There became a real sort of rejection of them. And so through the 80s, you start to see, more of a discussion about building new stadiums and all across the US, with, the sports leagues themselves sort of arguing that, they were neither sufficient for baseball nor football nor soccer. And so that trying to fit all of those sports under one roof wasn't really working out in terms of sight lines and the sort of fan experience. But really the sort of biggest component, I think, of the pushback against the concrete donuts was that they didn't allow for the kind of like luxury experiences that the leagues were starting to put a sort of premium on, of having, more tiered luxury boxes and different sorts of experiences that they could offer the fan, but also sort of like corporate clients that, weren't really serviced by these these stadiums that were architecturally designed to suit like sports as a middle class family pursuit. Sports was becoming, more diversified across, I think, class categories as well as sort of like corporate categories, and tied up with the culture in new and different ways that the leagues started pushing for and demanding, more diversified experiences that they could charge a larger premium for. And of course, there's other sort of components here too, of like sharing the stadium in a lot of these cities, Seattle included. Like one of the teams would had a better like lease deal and got to get, more money from tickets and from parking. And so then the other teams that were, part of it wanted their own stadium so that they could generate more revenue there as well. And of course, this also coincides with rising salaries, like especially in baseball, where the players were getting more and more money. And so the teams were feeling like in order to make a profit, they were having to diversify their revenue streams.
Yeah, all this is very interesting, and especially you put it in the context of the early 2000s when these two facilities were really kind of getting their sea legs, if you will, on the national stage with all these. Seattle kind of went from like, I want to say a backwater, but a relatively small major league city to something that was significantly energized by. How did you then augment this particular story into the other two locations in Atlanta and Minneapolis, St. Paul for the rest of this book?
Yeah, I think you put it really well in talking about Seattle and its shift from, maybe a sort of second tier city to, I don't know if it's quite a first tier city, but it certainly, at that time was really becoming a more well-known city that was not just a kind of flyover, not known for one particular industry, but was a sort of more of a major city. And I think that the other cities that I look at, the Twin Cities, Minneapolis in particular, and Atlanta are also sort of within that realm as well, as they're not a New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles. And initially I had actually been doing some research and was thinking that Los Angeles and SoFi Stadium in particular might be like one of the case studies that I would look at. But these three cities really shared in common this history of where sports had played a really central role in defining the city and sort of projecting the city's image on a larger scale. Earlier in the sort of concrete donut era of, really using a sort of discourse of how professional sports would put them on the map and make them a sort of big league city, attracting investors, new residents. But then in this, late 1990s through the sort of like mid 2000s of becoming a more sort of like global city, and those aspirations to become a more global city where sort of transnational flows of people and capital were also attracted and sort of coming through. And so those three cities, I think, sort of share that in common. And then they were also just cities that I had some sort of like personal connection to, so that I felt like I had connections to, be able to interview kind of interesting people, or that I felt like a personal connection to, because I think sports is so sort of like deeply affective. And even though, I guess that sort of influences the conclusions I come to. Like I lived in Bellingham, just north of Seattle, and spent a good amount of time in Seattle. And then I lived in the Twin Cities. That's where I did my PhD work. And I have some really, close friends in Atlanta. But I think that, it's felt sort of serendipitous to end up writing about the cities that I felt really sort of deeply connected to.
Let's talk about some of the geographical sort of considerations here, because these other two cities, right, have it's I think a little bit more, I won't say complex, but a little bit more multidimensional than the Seattle situation, which was largely kind of a replacement of the similar area that was already in use. I mean, maybe Atlanta, but let's talk about Minneapolis to start for a second. So, it's really interesting, especially when you look at the maps and stuff. And this book has got so much detail in it, but it's not overwhelmingly or dense per se. It's the ultimate. You can geek out on it in a healthy way. It's great. The point is a lot of this evolution from this, in your terms, first generation facility, in this case, Metropolitan Stadium, which was largely kind of a suburban Bloomington, I think it was, right? Where Mall of America is now.
Yeah. And I think that's the second generation. The first generation would really be the early 1900s.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But
Yeah,
I guess
I
the
didn't
point
end
is
up writing that, but
the
yes,
inter
yeah,
the trans
Metropolitan Stadium.
the
Yep.
transition from generation to generation, this was almost a rejection of the suburban kind of dynamic, if you
Yep.
will, and a rediscovery of the center city, maybe, like, maybe not unlike your Baltimore example.
Yeah, I mean, when the Hubert Humphrey Dome was built and to replace the suburban Met, if you will, it's sort of unfortunate that like the Twin Cities actually turned to like the domed idea pretty late on in the game. And so it was like very quickly out of date and sort of on the cusp of, the sort of like domed multi-purpose, like put the city on the map kind of piece, into the more like sort of place-based neighborhood localism that I think is more indicative of contemporary stadiums. And so, yeah, absolutely, there was an effort to bring people back downtown, and the Twin City, many cities during this period in the 1970s and 1980s, we're subject to a sort of like discourse of urban decline. And I talk about it in the book in terms of like the Twin Cities wasn't necessarily as affected by that for a variety of reasons, but there was still, a sort of concern about like what's gonna happen to downtown. And so that the bringing the stadium back downtown, was part of that effort to develop downtown to ensure that like newly suburbanizing folks would still use downtown. And so, the location of a lot of these stadiums, including those in Seattle and in Atlanta and the Twin Cities alike, were all really thoughtfully placed in relationship to highways to ensure that suburban fans could sort of get quickly, easily in and out. And so, yeah, there's definitely, I think, in all of the cities that I look at, um, there is a suburban urban dialectic that's playing out sort of always. And in some places it's more pronounced, in Atlanta, the suburban urban dialectic is very pronounced, especially most recently as the Twins sort of departed downtown Atlanta for the suburbs. But also, in this Minneapolis case where the Met initially was sort of built in suburban, out in the suburbs, and then there was a kind of later rejection of that.
Yeah, that's it. It's a rediscovering, if you will. And I need to give props to the Metrodome. That was the sort of the original impetus to get to downtown. But the then subsequent U.S. Bank Stadium that just renewed its commitment, if you will, to. But Atlanta's an even more perplexing kind of dynamic because in many respects that is a metropolitan area that is much more sprawling. I don't want to say by design, but it's just basically become that. And the interesting dynamic around the Mercedes-Benz stadium there, which itself very similarly replaced a second generation, in this case, first generation dome with the Georgia Dome. The location was not too far afield from that original Georgia Dome location, which has its own history because, as you go into and rightly so, the Olympics and the conversion, if you will, of a stadium that was built for the Olympics, but with a design to continue on as the home of the Atlanta Braves. Subsequently, this is a whole bunch of starts and stops, I guess, around thinking through about how facilities will live on and continue to live on. And now with the Braves moving, I know it's not the focus of your book, but it's certainly a focus of everybody in professional sports, especially the private equity entities that love them these days. Everybody wants to replicate Battery Park in the suburbs, the far-flung suburbs of Atlanta now, right? So it's really interesting, this dichotomy that exists now in Atlanta is the Braves have embraced this build it office park destination and they will come kind of dynamic, where Mercedes-Benz Stadium a few years before kind of said, we're going to stay in this area and continue to believe in, if you will, quote unquote, downtown Atlanta.
Yeah, Atlanta is a really complex case, and I feel like I sort of just scratched the surface. It's like it could have been a whole book, really, writing about Atlanta and its complex stadium history. And I think you rightly note that Atlanta is a city sort of famous for its sprawl, and so its suburban urban relationship is really distinct from the other cities that I look at as well, because the suburbs are and have been for a really long time also like very vibrant spaces, and also very diverse spaces, especially in terms of like racial diversity. Whereas that's not necessarily true, in Seattle or in the Twin Cities, where the suburbs are, very, very white. And so I think that the cultural politics that play out in Atlanta are really extremely complex in terms of the racial politics and histories, that are really specific to the city and to the particular neighborhoods, as well as to the sort of like suburban surrounding areas. Um, but yeah, I think, the differences between the Braves and the Falcons, and the soccer team there as well, also I guess plays at Mercedes-Benz Stadium, um, is is also like very specific to the politics. Like Arthur Blank owns the Falcons and has, sort of claimed his commitment to staying in Atlanta, and has really put a lot of like money and effort and philanthropy, and his foundation has really invested heavily in the Side neighborhoods around where the Mercedes-Benz Stadium was built in the former Georgia Dome Stadium, with a sort of promise to rectify the harms that stadium building has done on those neighborhoods over time and historically. Um, and I think it's a really complex case. I just keep using that word because, I think that it's hard to come down sort of ethically on if it's working or not, um, and practically if it's working or not. But I do credit them. Whereas the Braves, I think that there was a real sense that they abandoned the city and abandoned those neighborhoods that they had really sort of drawn a lot from once they, and having been located there for a long period of time. And there was a lot of destruction to those neighborhoods where Turner Field was built during the Olympics, and destruction before that from the Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, where whole blocks of the neighborhood had been cleared as part of urban renewal efforts, and tons of parking lots that were built to sort of service the Braves, and to service baseball in the city. And so when they decided to leave and they used this really highly publicized heat map, which was to show where Braves season ticket holders and ticket purchasers mostly came from. And it showed that they mostly came from the suburbs. And so that they claimed that they were just moving towards moving to be closer to their fans. Um, and so, yeah, I think that there was definitely a sense of abandonment by many folks in the city about that decision. But undoubtedly, right, the Battery has been hugely successful. They've made a big effort to kind of replicate the feel of that particular neighborhood, to like feel urban and to bring in, sort of like local vendors to make it feel very Atlanta. And my friends in Atlanta like love going there, so it's a really interesting, yeah, it's an interesting dynamic.
Well, look, I think it's also typical, frankly, of a lot of 90s and maybe early 2000s kind of sports developments, maybe even a decade earlier too, where it was sort of this notion of you build the stadium, you build the arena, and they will come, so to speak. But there's almost an abject neglect or less care, if you will, for what's around it, aside from parking and anything else that's going to directly make the process better, right? For the fans that are coming to the games. And it's always this sort of this tension between what's promised in terms of economic development and the reality, right? And we've seen this many different flavors and times and stuff in places big and small, where places like I'm just trying to think, like a Prudential Center in Newark, right, where the Devils play hockey. It's a steps away from Newark Penn Station, and it's in Newark, and Newark is, has its hits and misses in terms of and there's not a lot of development around it per se, and it's not necessarily the safest place to walk from the train station to it at night, right? So just because you're plopping down a state-of-the-art facility in a location, especially one that maybe could benefit from investment and building and that kind of stuff, or cultural, cultural destination kind of thing. I think the reality is, especially in the American society, right, with driving being kind of predominant, it makes for a very difficult case, if you will, to build stuff around it and or I guess sort of expand that sort of economic thing aside from game day per se. And to the case of the Battery, right, which everybody wants to replicate. It seems like they think about that first, right? Let's build everything around this, including the stadium, so that we don't have to worry about building it thereafter. I don't know. There's some insight in it wrapped up in what I just said, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what makes the Battery and, the decision of the Braves to move out there so interesting is that it's so counter to what's been happening over the last, 20 years or even 25 years since Camden Yards, where there's been a real desire to locate sports in urban areas, and to connect them to what feels like a more sort of authentic sense of culture. So, not feel like a mall, not feel like a sort of like Disney theme park, whereas the Battery to an extent seems to really harken back to that, that sort of mall, like Disneyified feeling that really runs counter to so much of, the sportification of place currently, where it's much more so, right, urban, hip, cool, authentic, connected to local culture, really trying to like play up a sense of very specific place-based identity. And so I think that it's a complicated case, but it is a case that sort of runs counter to so much of what's been happening. But you're exactly right as well that, stadiums have historically made big economic returns promises in terms of development and sort of like regeneration of neighborhoods where the stadiums are located. And, there's just a wealth of academic research that shows that that's clearly not the case. And yet the stadiums continue to be built along the lines of that promise, although the discourse has sort of changed to be more that, well, even if you can't measure it in exact economic dollars, they come out sort of immaterially in terms of the brand identity that the stadium, produces, and the ways in which it, sort of cultivates a sense of like safety and vibrancy of a particular place. And I think that in many of the areas that I looked at, especially in, Seattle and to an extent in the Twin Cities as well, the stadiums are definitely influencing the sort of like local neighborhood space in that way. And there's a lot of development that's happening and is sort of like sports themed and aimed to create that sense of sort of like safety and vibrancy for people to come, not just for game day, right, but to come as part of a neighborhood where you live, work, and play 24/7. And that's a real sort of emphasis, I think, that urban planners, city or like neighborhood planners are really sort of trying to take with the developments that, even if they're not built along the lines of Battery Park or of the Atlanta Battery, to be, all designed around the stadium from the get-go, there is an emphasis on how do you sort of like redesign, right, or encourage a sort of redesign of space from the people who are already sort of living there, the residences or the businesses, to incorporate that sense of sporting fun and entertainment and play into the neighborhood. And I think that Seattle and the industrial district is a kind of interesting case in terms of this, because some of the kinds of industry and manufacturing that the district has historically been known for are in decline. And so it becomes this space where the kind of more like contemporary spaces of fun industry around like the culture industry can start to take shape. And you're starting to see some of that being built into the kinds of urban planning around what they want to build, a sort of like stadium district around T-Mobile Park and Lumen Field, to try to encourage that kind of sort of cultural industrial development.
That's exceedingly interesting. All right, I didn't mean to drag you into economics of all that kind of stuff, because Lord knows we can go specifically in all that, and how cities get played against each other, and the tax bases, and who's paying for it all, and well, these billionaires getting all these tax incentives and all that kind of stuff. But I do want to, before we wrap up, I do want to get more specifically definitional on this connection, which we call between sports and media infrastructure via these stadia. Can you kind of maybe in more layman's terms, I guess, for our audience, give us a sense of sort of what that sort of thesis kind of is? I think I've got an understanding of it, but I'm not sure our audience may necessarily, because I don't think people maybe immediately think of a facility or stadium and that which is quote unquote media. It probably needs some definitional nuancing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely don't want to get too academic here, but there is a kind
No,
of
that's
shift.
okay. You are a smart person, and we do like to talk about smart things, so that's
Yeah.
okay.
Well, there is a shift in media studies to think about like media beyond just what we see on screens, right? Which we kind of study as like representations of like studying a TV show and looking at, particular texts of media. But our media world is so much more than that. And it includes all of the infrastructure, which is, material. Stuff, I think it is like Shannon Mattern says that it's like the stuff that you can kick, right? And so the way that we get media, like fiber optic cables or, undersea cables or telephone poles, right? These are all also part of our media world, our media culture. And so I think that stadiums and like buildings more generally are kind of interesting to think about in terms of media culture today, because the buildings themselves are so filled with the media stuff that you can kick. And so one of the best parts of my research was when I got a tour from the folks at Mercedes-Benz Stadium, and they showed me, the deep underground where all the fiber optic cables line the whole stadium, and that the stadium itself was built in order to accommodate all sorts of media, whether that was the fiber optic cables that were going to make possible, the fast Wi-Fi and the, new coming AI, or the outpost or the garages where the broadcasting trucks can come in and plug into the building so that they can capture the feed, or the press room, or all of the sort of media production rooms to film the game, all the cameras, right? The whole stadium is built around being able to mediate what happens there. So in the book, I talk about that if you think about a stadium in terms of media infrastructure, right? This material media or media infrastructure, or in terms of media culture more generally, that the stadium itself, right, is mediated so that it has all of this, media infrastructure inside of it. It's built around the media, but it's also mediating so that the building itself communicates, right? It communicates the city's brand. It also communicates the sport or whatever event is taking place in the stadium, right? Because it is mediated, so it can mediate. But then it's also mediatizing, which the stadiums also become sort of grounds for getting media out to the city more broadly. And one example of this is also at Atlanta, where the weapons detection system that they used in the stadium was a sort of testing ground for weapons detection systems that the city later started employing in other areas as well, such as in public schools, so that, the stadium itself is also part of bringing the media within the stadium to the city more widely. So that is my thoughts about why, the stadium is kind of a neglected piece of media, that we don't think about it as media, but it really, it's so inextricably intertwined with media culture that you can't really, talk about it as just a building, right? It's just intertwined with every part of our media world.
It's almost like it's the modern day studio, so to speak, in both facets, or maybe multiple facets. One is studio as, if you will, production facility for the game and all the things that are around the game for the televised audience, right? The audio visual kind of thing, but also as itself as a destination. It's like, I would call it a circus, but there are things there, whether it's the signage and sound and ancillary events or the tailored events and things there, right? Which have nothing to do per se. Maybe they're not televised at all. It's just about the experience being there, right? So it feels almost flexibly infrastructure wise in terms of media. I guess
Absolutely.
if you can pull the word media into different directions, it seems like this is almost the encapsulation of that.
Absolutely. And in terms of like television broadcasting in particular, it is the most, right now, sports stadiums are the most important television production facilities.
Sports is having a moment in media, isn't it? For
They're
sure.
basically like keeping legacy media companies alive, and are the new, the next frontier for streaming media as well. But you're right that as well, they are destinations of themselves. They're iconic structures, especially these new stadiums are built to really like stand out, to be places that really visibly communicate particular things. Many of them have, public art for people to come and to sort of experience. And that public art is often like participatory and interactive in terms of, light projection or, mirroring. And so, yeah, they're really sort of interesting media infrastructures.
All right, so let me wrap up then with a couple of questions. Sort of, it's more your hot takes on this kind of stuff, right? So, we just kind of zeroed in on the modern day kind of phenomenon, right? I mean, these stadiums and arenas and the money behind them, and it just seemed to get one, out topping the other in terms of amenities and now, frankly, the lifespan of these facilities, right, is getting ever smaller. I mean, 20 years now, it's kind of a has-been, right? Because the next generation of technology or two, perhaps because of this media infrastructure you're talking about, it just requires so much more updating, modernization, that kind of stuff, just by the standards of being better or the best or world class, right? That definition seems to change every 5 years. What is your sense now of? First of all, do you feel like there's more to explore in this field? I got to think so, considering that it keeps regenerating itself. Or are you just done with the topic?
No, I've definitely been thinking about it, and thinking about especially the global aspect of stadium building. And, I think that is a really interesting area to explore as well. And I don't really get into the global aspect of the book. I talk about it a little bit at the end in terms of, sort of European development, especially of football stadiums there, and some of the changes that I think are influenced by the US model. So I think that's something interesting, to sort of go beyond. And I absolutely think that these stadiums, even though a lot of folks that I talked to kept saying like, oh yeah, we're building these new stadiums to be future flexible. But there's only so much of the future that you can anticipate. So undoubtedly these stadiums are going to go by the wayside, and we're going to see something, totally new. I think that the sort of greenification of stadiums is also really interesting, of like the ways in which stadiums are increasingly being built to sort of respond to concerns about like climate change and other sorts of like pollution and sort of environmental concerns. But then of course, like AI, right? I think that everything has changed. And certainly like in the last couple of years, you know, and I wrote this book, you know, I finished it up right on the like heels basically of ChatGPT being released. So, yeah, I think that leaves a big question mark about how that's going to change the stadiums, but also to change cities, right? And neighborhoods. And like as work is so, you know, remote, and I'm sure there's going to be changes in the workforce that as AI sort of comes in and, you know, changes jobs and shifts what people are doing. So I think that the stadiums and our relationship to sports is going to change as a reflection of that as well.
I know this is a little outside your zone here, but what's your gut feeling about the arms race, I guess, for these facilities? You know, I'm not going to bury the lead here, but I'm very wary of all the private equity money and all the just there's a lot of, it feels like there's a lot of big inflation and lots of sports and I just, does it ever end, or will it, you know, does it just keep on going?
I mean, I don't know. I wish that I knew, right? I could probably, you know, that's like predicting the future, but I think there's got to be a bubble, right? Like it has to end at some level, but you know, I guess that probably people, you know, in the 60s were saying that too, or in the 70s. So who knows, right?
Okay, I guess I'll sort of re-ask the question in sort of in a
Sorry,
capstone manner.
if I
Um,
missed the
no,
question.
no, 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 no. I may personalize this. So, given this work and your still relative interest in it, perhaps on an international scale, or perhaps in some other you know, more modern expressions in the years to come as more stadiums come online, where do you find going to stadiums now? Uh, is it fun to go with you to a sporting event, or are you are you distracted by all the little nooks and crannies and stuff, and your the framing perhaps of can you enjoy a sporting event now versus having it seen through the lens of your academic research and your writing?
I'd like to think that I'm still really fun to go to sporting events with. I mean, I love sports. And I do think that there is something about the sort of like affective dimensions that these new facilities help to cultivate. Um, and maybe that it's not so new. I think that probably there is just something about, you know, being amongst a lot of people, especially if you're a fan of a particular team. You know, I definitely felt like more connected when I went to the stadiums in Seattle and in the Twin Cities than in Atlanta, because I don't really root for Atlanta teams. So I think, you know, I can geek out on all of these things, but that at the end of the day, I think, and I do try to get at it in this book, that I don't think that those connections between fans and sporting teams and their cities and their neighborhoods, or even in the stadium, are just, you know, completely inauthentic and totally commodified and, you know, just completely artificial. I think that there is something, you know, that is really a sense of sort of like deep love and connection. You know, I guess I get sad that that connection isn't put towards uh, I guess more sort of like socially just political pursuits. Um, but I think that there is something there that is real and that's meaningful to people. And I think that we do an injustice to fans and to individuals when we don't take that seriously.
So I love this book not only because of the detail and stuff, but it's also kind of a thinking person's approach to, and from a couple of different angles. I mean, there's clearly a bunch of other books that are focused on the economics of it and the town, not a town and gown. What am I trying to say? Sort of the sports team and city or civic relationship, or that lack thereof. But you know, you could even look at it this, having read this book and sort of gone a little bit deeper with sort of some of these the actual stadiums involved here. I mean, you could even see it like even in job descriptions of these teams and facilities, right? You have people who are like day of game program manager, right? These or people who are in the social media thing on the sidelines, right? Every team, every league, even the facilities themselves have their own social media and production teams, generating content for internal as well as external use. It really is it's almost like theater, right? And it's the event of sports and or whatever else is going on. It is very much like a production facility and has so many media elements to it. This book really expands your mind a bit about sort of like what you're getting into when you buy a ticket and you're going inside the venue.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that surprised me the most is like how, toilets are digitized in many stadiums. And so like the most mundane thing that you think, doesn't have any sort of like media element to it is like completely tied up to this whole media infrastructure.
All right, here is my last question. I'm sorry that you sparked it because I remember this was also part of your thing. Do you worry about, and I think you do hint on some of this, so I think I'm kind of loading the question. Let's put the bathroom thing on the side for a second, but the idea of all the technology and all the now AI and electronics and stuff, how can I best put it? The fear or the worry about surveillance and all these other things. Security certainly plays a role in all this stuff. There's probably some worrisome elements to this evolution. No?
Yeah, yeah. And I definitely talk about this fairly extensively in the book, in particular around the Twin Cities stadiums, but that this is something that's being, sort of folded into all contemporary stadiums and is definitely a reason why some of the the teams that own older stadiums are looking for new spaces, is the ability to really data mine through building in digital infrastructure that can really sort of like do deep data mining of every single movement of fans and, like literally watch their eyeballs and see where their eyeballs are during particular moments of the game. And that just kind of freaks me out in general. And maybe that's my age. I don't know, but
No, I think it should freak everybody up, but it's
but
buried in the small print that's no longer on a printed ticket because nobody has a printed ticket anymore. But it's
yes, exactly.
you're giving up
Yeah.
your right to be surveilled. Yeah.
Yep. And, and I think they do this in the name of fan experience and that they're promising you a better, frictionless, touchless experience where, the stadium really knows you and can cultivate a very individualized experience. And I think that's enticing to a level, but I think that it also is, deeply problematic for the kinds of hierarchies that it creates as well. And that, certain fans are being catered to in a particular way, whereas other fans are being, catered to in a different way. And then indeed, other people altogether are not really seen as fans because they don't have the kinds of, economic or cultural capital that can, best be exploited through their particular, data. And I think that speaks back to the Braves, choosing to move outside of Atlanta. Like they are catering to a particular type of fan, and that type of fan is known to them through the data that they mine. And that means that then they don't market to and connect to and serve other potential fandoms in Atlanta. And if sports teams are supposed to represent a city and provide a space of civic pride and community building and unification, then what does that mean when a sports team, chooses to celebrate and take pride in and unify and create community for only a very particular small slice of the city, or international investors or tourists? And I think, that is, I spoke, a little bit earlier about how I think that there is something really meaningful and important about sports fandom and the connections that we feel to our teams, but where we're using this data in order to cultivate a particular kind of fan, I think that we lose a lot of that potential for what sports can be.
All right, our thanks to the good doctor, a fascinating, intriguing conversation. I will not look at current and consider past stadia the same way again. And I am thankful for not only this conversation, but this really intriguing book. If you're a geek for stadiums and the sports teams that inhabit them and the broader implications of their existence, you would do worse than to get yourself a copy of this very intriguing little book called Stadium City, Sports and Media Infrastructure in the United States, by our guest this week, Helen Morgan Parmett, the good doctor, Helen Morgan Parmett. And it is published by our friends at the University of Illinois Press, for goodness sakes. It is available now, as they say, wherever good books are found. And of course, you can support the show by purchasing it through our referral links to our friends at Amazon, who will, of course, send it to you in the manner in which you'd like to consume it most, either in paperback or hardcover or even Kindle versions. All you got to do is click on our affiliate links in either the podcast description, however you receive this podcast, or by going to our little website. It's goodseatsstillavailable.com. And you just search up the episode numbered, what is this episode, 428? And you'll find the convenient links there. And of course, we will get shekels, a handful of shekels, not much more than that. But hey, every bit counts of referral love from our friends at Amazon. And we'll get another reprieve for a month or two to keep our lights on, pay the electricity and the internet connection bill and all that kind of stuff, to get these shows to you each and every week, which we know you depend on and can't live without. Ha ha. While you're on our website, check out our friends at royalretros.com and who else? Oldschoolshirts.com and some of our other merch we have available. It's another great way to support the show and get some stuff to show your love for a former team or a league or even a stadium, for goodness sakes, in a t-shirt or other form. There's a great way to sort of kill two birds with one stone, as it were. You can send us email. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Always enjoy your comments and suggestions and thoughts and the like. And of course, please do follow us on the various socials. We're probably most active on both Blue Sky and X. You'll find us on Blue Sky at goodseatsstillavailable.com. You'll find us on X at goodseatsstill. And we're also semi-active in other places, mostly under the handle Good Seats Still Available, all one word, including YouTube, where we also stream these episodes. It's another way to consume each week's proceedings. So it's all there for you. Make it yours, shall we say, and tell your friends and have them tell two friends and so on and so on. We appreciate your referral love that way as well. Thank you, of course, to Jerry Payne for his audio excellence this week. Another year for the good Dr. Jerry down there and myself, a little collaboration each week production-wise. Appreciate his help in that. Lord knows the recording of this stuff needs it, and we don't know what we would do without him, that's for sure. And we don't know what we would do without you, because frankly, we are just floored by the commentary, the people that email us out of the blue, people famous and not so famous, people who out there, and we appreciate, who just love what we do, occasionally like what we do, heard one episode and it's the only one they've liked, but they've really gone deep on it and told their friends about it. However you found or share this show, we appreciate it immensely, and many, many more to come in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you for listening, as always. See ya.